If my colleagues will indulge me for just 1 minute, I want to speak quickly to the elections that just took place in Venezuela. We applaud the Venezuelan people for their participation in the July 28th presidential election. We commend their courage and commitment to democracy in the face of repression and in the face of adversity. We've seen the announcement just a short while ago by the Venezuelan Electoral Commission. We have serious concerns that the result announced does not reflect the will or the votes of the Venezuelan people. It's critical that every vote be counted fairly and transparently, that election officials immediately share information with the opposition and independent observers without delay, and that the electoral authorities publish the detailed tabulation of votes. The international community is watching this very closely and will respond accordingly.
Well, joining us now from Venezuela is Ajamu Baraka, chair of the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace and senior editor at the Black Agenda Report. You may also recognize him as the vice presidential candidate with the Green Party in 2016. Ajamu, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
So you observed the elections. Is Secretary Blinken right? Did the result announced not reflect the will or the vote of the Venezuelan people?
We have no understanding why he has taken that position. Clearly, he has information that no one else has. One of the things that one can conclude about elections in Venezuela is that it doesn't really matter if you support the current government or not. It's pretty clear that most people consider that the process here, the voting process, is one of the cleanest in the world. So if there's going to be charges of fraud, then those charges have to be provided with empirical evidence. They have a process here where they have the opposition is to station their observers in the various voting booths. They have biometric validation of the voter. They have a two-step process that doesn't exist in the U.S. where you have a paper ballot to verify your electronic vote so that those two numbers will correspond if everything is correct. And they have audits before, during, and after the vote. So you can't just make an assertion that there's supposed to be irregularities without providing some empirical evidence to back that up. And that hasn't happened because it doesn't really exist. So again, this is part of the Western narrative to undermine the legitimacy of the process in Venezuela, simply because the U.S. government, the U.S. state, is opposed to the Venezuelan experiment.
Yeah, it's really interesting that Secretary Blinken would say this when the reality is the U.S. wasn't there. There was no one there from the United States to actually observe this election, from the government of the United States, I should say. Obviously, you were there. There's others who were there looking at, observing the election, but no one from the government was actually there. So what evidence do they have to say this was a sham election, essentially, like they've always said over and over? How did you get involved? So how did you become an election observer there?
Well, there was an invitation to bring in people from around the world because I think there's an understanding that there was probably going to be this attempt to try to undermine the legitimacy of the process. So the Black Alliance for Peace was invited to send a representative, and they chose me to come down to be that person. This is not the first time I've been in Venezuela to observe elections. In fact, this is the third time. So I have some experience here also. So it was a very eye-opening experience, though, for people who hadn't done it before. They were really impressed, again, with this process. And when we were actually in the field observing the vote yesterday, many people from around the world who had seen this for the first time, or was watching it for the first time, were impressed with things like, for example, within a 3-block radius or so, there was something like 8 different polling places. There were tremendous lines, but it was clear that people were going to have an opportunity to, in fact, cast their votes. something that you don't see in the U.S., where you have one precinct that is attempting to satisfy the voting desire of thousands of people sometimes. So this is part of the experience that they have perfected here, I think, in Venezuela.
Tell us the difference of how the people vote in Venezuela compared to the United States. Like, what do you see that they're doing versus how we do it? That's something, ways that are different and ways that are even similar.
Well, and then one thing is, as I just indicated, the number of polling places, the process of having a paper ballot to back up your electronic vote, the fact uh, that there is a process in which people are encouraged to, in fact, vote by having the election on the weekend as opposed to a working day. These are just some of the technical differences you see in Venezuela that we don't have in the United States of America.
When you talk to the Venezuelan people right now, now that the election has been announced, and if Secretary Blinken's right and this is a sham election and this doesn't reflect the will of or the vote of the actual people, I would imagine that there would be large demonstrations on the street, people all screaming that this was a sham, that they're living in a dictatorship. I mean, what's the sentiment on the street right now? Now that the results have been announced.
Well, as you can imagine, it is sort of polarized between those voters that gave their vote to the current government and the opposition. Now, the
Hmm.
opposition, of course, has issues because they were split themselves. But in certain neighborhoods, there's a resistance. In fact, I was telling Ben that I'm here in the hotel. I had planned to be someplace else for the meeting, but because this hotel is in a community that is a oppositional community, if you will, we have not been allowed to leave the hotel because, uh, as people might remember, the opposition here in Venezuela is very violent. They
Hmm.
were responsible for burning people alive, killing people in various gruesome ways a few years ago. So you have to be very, very cautious with this opposition. So they are in the streets. They are making noises. They don't accept the results, and so it is something that will probably continue for the next few days. But in terms of, for the most part, of the rest of the country, I think their satisfaction that their voices have been heard. They understand that the the decision was going to be between surrendering their dignity and independence, versus um, becoming a puppet of the U.S. or
Hmm.
standing strong and independent. So this is something they understood. As we talked to voters yesterday, and it's quite clear that for the most part, even though they know they're going to suffer, there's going to be more sanctions probably. The sentiment of the people was that they were going to stand strong with their process, with their experiment, and to maintain their dignity and independence.
What is it that people like about Maduro versus those who don't like Maduro? Is there a difference that you can see from the two sides? I mean, here in the United States, sometimes it's a little difficult to determine why a person, what would compel a person to vote Democrat versus Republican. I mean, we do have some stats that are okay, it's majority this one group that votes this way or this one group that votes the other, or people who care about XYZ issue, might vote Democrat versus Republican. What are you seeing there in Venezuela? Those that are supportive of Maduro versus those who support the opposition.
Well, one of the differences we have in a space like Venezuela is that even though we know that it's framed outside Venezuela, primarily in the West, in North America, as this clash of personalities, for the most part here, it's about politics. It's about the structures and parties as opposed to personalities. And
Hmm.
so the people who are supporting and who voted for Maduro as the leader, if you will, of their process did that because they believe in the process itself, the politics represented by the Venezuelan Socialist Party. Their attempt to try to bring about a revolutionary, fundamental change in their country. So these are the terms of struggle in this country, as opposed to personality struggles we find in places like the United States. So the issues here is independent development. It is developing structures that will allow for people to fully develop their humanity. It's about centering the needs of the people and seeing those needs as fundamental human rights needs. Is about maintaining their independence. So, these are the ideals that they believe that they are supporting. And it's about solidarity they see for not only the people of Venezuela, but the people in this region. They want to
Hmm.
have a situation where they can experience peace as opposed to this constant war and being subjected to these illegal sanctions. And people need to remember these sanctions are in fact illegal, but these illegal sanctions that have been imposed on them in order to undermine the possibility of their process.
Hmm. What type of person votes for the opposition? What do they support?
Many of them are individuals who want to see a return to the past, where Venezuela was one of the most unequal societies in the region. They are very much opposed to any idea that they're going to the economy will be transformed and power will shift to workers. They want very much to see a society in which people like Maduro and the idea of socialism are crushed to the ground. And so they don't want to see any change. In fact, they want to return to the past. They are pro-capitalist and is reflected in their values and their behavior. The way they deal with political differences is to engage in violence, even though we know that the narrative in the West, in the U.S. in particular, is the opposite. They're supposed to be the supporters of the revolution that are the violent ones, but that's not the case. And most people in the world know that to be true.
Yeah. The election was still fairly close. I mean, it wasn't close, not like what we see here in the US, but it was, I mean, the opposition still got over 40% of the vote. So it seems like there's a lot of people who
Yeah.
do support that idea versus the other side, right?
No, there's no question. There's no question that there's support for the right. But Kim, is a situation for those of us who've been around a while that is, it reminds us of what happened in Nicaragua, where the people were basically beaten down by years of counter-revolutionary violence and sanctions, and it resulted in, by 1990, the Sandinista movement losing political power. The sanctions that are imposed on Venezuela has the intent of, in fact, doing that, of beating people down, of creating economic hardships to undermine support for the process, to help people to or have people to come to the conclusion that the socialist experiment is not worth it. Uh,
Hmm.
the U.S. authorities understood that those sanctions are going to drive people out of the country and really bring them to the borders. You can't understand the situation with the border in the U.S. without understanding the consequences of the draconian sanctions that have been imposed on Venezuela and other countries here in the region.
Yeah, it's definitely there's definitely something very amiss in Venezuela, whether it be caused by the United States or whatever the causes are. Those of that is, we are seeing a lot of Venezuelans leave Venezuela, and a lot of them are coming here to the United States. They're showing up at the border, so there's definitely a crisis there. And if the root cause is the United States constantly trying to topple the government of Venezuela, install their own government in Venezuela, sanctioning Venezuela, doing all of these things. That is a question I think that the American people should ask the government, our government. How does this benefit us? What do you think because clearly it doesn't. I mean, if we've got floods of Venezuelans coming to the border, it isn't helping the United States. It isn't in the best interest of the American people. What do you think it is that the U.S. wants? Like, why are they so hell bent on getting rid of Maduro? We saw them give a standing ovation to Juan Guaido during the State of the Union. They tried to install him as the president. Even though they're claiming they're for democracy, they then pick out their guy and try to put him in place as if that's somehow democratic. They've tried to coup Maduro, kill Maduro. I mean, they've tried all of these various things, all in the name of democracy, ironically. What do you think it is that the U.S. really has it out for Venezuela for? Is it simply just we need to stop the rise of socialism? Is there something else there that the U.S. wants? What do you think it is?
You kind of hit the nail on the head, your last comment, that basically any notion of a socialist alternative is a threat to the U.S. And so they want to make sure that these experiments are not successful. And so that is the main objective, to drive people away from the process, to undermine the ability of the governments in places like Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua, to turn away from the idea that there in fact can be an alternative to the kind of capitalist barbarism that's been normalized in most of the world. So yeah, that's the objective, and the consequence has been the suffering of the Venezuelan people. People have to remember that, for example, at the height of the pandemic, it was the U.S. government that was undermining the ability of the Venezuelans to be able to secure things as simple as COVID testing kits. And when the it was made available, when the vaccines were made available, they attempted to undermine the ability of the government to secure vaccines, and the
Hmm.
result was thousands of people unnecessarily losing their lives. So this is the kind of draconian activity that the U.S. state is involved in, simply to make sure that there are no viable alternatives to what they see as the normalized process of capitalist the development and their so-called liberal democracy, a democracy that we see unraveling in the U.S. as they are interfering in the democratic processes of countries around the world, and in particular here in Venezuela.
Yeah. I would imagine with you having been the vice presidential candidate in 2016 for the Green Party that you're perhaps still supporting the Green Party would be my guess. That perhaps you're supporting Jill Stein, Dr. Jill Stein. Um, what do you think would be the policies of Dr. Jill Stein if she were to win the presidency towards Venezuela, and compare her policy to what you think? Well, we've seen Trump in action, what he would do when it comes to Venezuela versus what you think Kamala Harris would do when it comes to Venezuela.
I'm quite sure that Dr. Stein would not continue to pursue illegal activities like the sanction regime that the U.S. has imposed on Venezuela. I'm sure that she will be faithful in her commitment to have the U.S. live in harmony with its neighbors, not attempt to impose its ideals on the peoples of this region and really of the world. So there should be a fundamental change in the relationship between the U.S. And the Venezuelan government. Uh, we all recognize, and Dr. Stein recognizes that with the with the Democrats and the Republicans, the policy toward Venezuela is the same. People have to remember that it was the Obama administration that really intensified the subversion of Venezuela, and that was continued under Trump and under Biden. So there's a bipartisan commitment on the part of the elite in the U.S. to undermine this process. Why Venezuela? It's because of the role that Venezuela plays on a regional level. Its oil wealth was shared throughout the region. Uh, the regional development was really dependent on a viable Venezuelan economy. So the U.S. strategy of full spectrum dominance that has a regional focus, where they attempt to undermine any regional power that can threaten U.S. interests, was fully implemented here in this region, and that's why Venezuela found itself in the crosshairs of U.S. subversion, attempts to murder Maduro, and to dismantle the revolutionary process. That's why they reimpose all kinds of sanctions, including the continuation of the embargo on Cuba. That's why they've been attempting to try to undermine Nicaragua, helped to support coup attempts in Bolivia and in Peru, coup the government of Honduras, and the list goes on and on. This is
Hmm.
an anti-democratic process that the U.S. pursues, and that's why many of us make the argument that the greatest existential threat to democracy and human rights emanates not from countries like Venezuela, but in fact from the United States of America.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think we should be a beacon and an example for the world, but then ultimately the people in these other countries need to decide for themselves if they see America and they love the way America's run and they think that's the way I want my country run, they will work on their own to change that within their own countries. They don't need us to come and rescue them from their dictators, the people that we label as dictators. They don't that's it's so, to me, demeaning. It's also dehumanizing when Americans think that we're the big bad, we're the heroes. We're so much better than all the people in the world that we can do what they can't do. They can't take care of themselves. They're like little children. Really, we should just be a shining beacon. We should be an example if we could get our act together, of course. And then other countries will want to emulate that if they think that what we have is really great. But if they don't, then they won't. And that's just the reality of it. It's very, so you're saying that you think, because, unfortunately, I think the reality is, as much as I love Dr. Jill Stein, it's likely it's going to be either Harris or Trump who wins the White House next year, um, who ends up in the White House next year. So you're saying you don't think that their policies will be any different. You think that the two of them are going to be two sides of the same, and the Venezuelan people will continue to suffer.
Not only do I think that it's going to be the continuation of the suffering of the Venezuelan people, but the suffering of people around the world. The U.S. state and the elite, they are bent on trying to maintain their global hegemony. They have decided to do that they are going to use their military force, their military might to, in fact, do that. They've already unleashed their intelligence agencies to ensure that that is successful. So both of these parties represent two sectors of the ruling class, of the elite. And they are united, though, in their commitment to maintaining U.S. hegemony. So, no, there will be no fundamental change in policies. The only way there would be changes is if there is a viable, progressive movement in the U.S. that puts pressure on the U.S. authorities to alter their standing as a international rogue state and to cease and desist in being a terrorist state and live in harmony with their neighbors. That means that the responsibility for change of the U.S. government really resides with the people in the U.S. But it's
Yeah.
difficult to organize that kind of movement when you don't have any ability to get that kind of alternative perspective to the American people.
Yeah. Ajamu, thank you so much for joining us from Venezuela, where you've been observing the election. Thank you so much for your insight and clarity on this. We got a lot of fake news in America. I mean, that's what it really boils down to, is that our government just says stuff without actually fact checking it, without actually doing the work, and you're out there doing the work. So we really appreciate you, Ajamu. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Hey guys, this was just a clip of a longer show. Catch the full show by going to KimIversonShow.com. It is free. It airs Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. You could go back now and watch this full interview. I highly recommend it. Again, go to KimIversonShow.com. Thank you so much for watching.